Hi, this is the 5th class in the Foundation series, and today we're going to talk about the Bible. What do you say when someone says they don't believe the Bible, or that the Bible is just full of errors and contradictions, or that you can't use the Bible to prove the Bible? Or what about the other writings that weren't included in the Bible? You know, the lost books of the Bible. Why weren't they included? And were they really lost? You know, when I was a kid back in the 1950s, I read a lot of comic books. And on the inside cover of the last page of the comic book, they were always selling something, whether it was X-ray specs or something like that. Well, many times they would have an ad in there for the lost books of the Bible. And they would advertise it by saying things like, read the books that the church doesn't want you to read. And they made it sound, ooh, like the church is keeping something from you. Well, at the time I wasn't interested in spiritual things. As I've said before, I didn't become a Christian until I was 24 years of age. But a lot of people have questions about the lost books of the Bible. And the interesting thing is, regarding these lost books, they weren't lost. The Jews and the early Christians knew all about them. They didn't include them because they were clearly inferior to the biblical books, and we'll talk about that later. But what about the person who says, prove to me scientifically that God exists? Well, to be honest with you, I can't. Not because the proof isn't there, but because the scientific method isn't applicable to historical things. There's two kinds of proof. There's the scientific method. Now, to use this method, you must be able to observe something, measure that observation, record the results, and repeat the results. Repeat the experiment, and you've got to repeat it many times. This method usually yields 100% proof of something. So if it's not observable, measurable, recordable, and repeatable, you can't use the scientific method. The other method of proof is what some people call the legal/historical method. And this is used on things that are unrepeatable. Like crimes, or like historical events, or historical persons. With this method, we can gather many evidences and prove beyond a reasonable doubt, but not beyond any doubt, that something existed. It's where a preponderance of the evidence leads us to. We prove the unknown from the known. I can't prove love exists because I can't observe, measure, record, and repeat it. I can observe its effects, but I can't see it or weigh love, so I can't use the scientific method. In fact, there's a lot of things that we believe in completely, but we can't prove scientifically. I believe George Washington existed, but I can't prove it scientifically. Now, I may use some science in proving that he existed, but I'm not using the scientific method. I can't observe him, I can't record him, I can't repeat the observation. Since Christianity and the Bible and the resurrection of Jesus and all of that stuff, since all of those are historical events, we have to use the legal historical method of proof. So, for example, to prove Washington existed, I could go to writings that are supposedly from him. Do they match up with what other contemporaries of his time say about him? Do his events match up with events of that time era? Are we talking about the same person named George Washington, et cetera, et cetera? So based on a preponderance of all this evidence, I can say that George Washington existed, that he was the President of the United States, he was the commander of the Continental Army, things like that. But before we put our trust in the Bible, we've got to ask ourselves this question: is the Bible reliable? Because if it's not, why should I trust my life with it? There are 4 tests that historians use to prove any historical document: the bibliographic test, the internal test, the external test, and the archaeological test. Now, the bibliographical test tests for historicity and validity. In other words, how do we know it's been translated correctly over the years? Now, that's one thing. Now, many of you have probably heard of this test. It's called the psycholinguistic experiment. You have a bunch of people in a circle and you whisper to the person next to you a story. Not a very long story. You might say, I live in a blue house, I have a green car, whatnot. You say a few things like that. By the time that gets around to you, it doesn't sound anything like you initially started out with. But if we do this with the Bible, let's say we've discovered a Bible that was printed in 1600 AD, and then we compare it with one that we know was printed in about 300 AD. You might think, well, wow, there's going to be some big differences. Actually, no. We find that they're almost identical. The only differences are either in translations of certain words. If one of the Bibles was translated in the Syriac language, and the other was in the Greek language, well, we know the New Testament was written in Greek, and it was eventually translated to Syriac. So when we translate both of those into English, sometimes the Syriac words will not translate completely as the Greek words will. So that's the only differences in translations of certain words or word order. For example, if I said there's the big brown house, a Syriac edition, because of how it's translated, might say it's the brown big house. But that's it. This can be said of no other historical document in existence. Now, I'm passing out to you a handout which talks about this. For instance, Caesar's Gallic Wars. That actually took place around 50 BC. The earliest copy we have is 900 AD. That's a difference of 950 years. And we only have 10 copies of them. And when we compare the copies we do have with each other, while they're pretty accurate, they're not anywhere near as accurate as the Bibles are for that time difference. Another interesting thing is the earliest Bible we have is 125 AD in terms of the New Testament. And the New Testament took place, the New Testament times took place from, let's say, 4 or 5 BC when Jesus was born, up to about 96 AD. But the actual writing of these books, I think the earliest New Testament book that was written was the book of James, and that was in 44 AD. So between 44 AD and 125 AD, that's like 80 years. That is a whole lot different than Caesar's Gallic Wars, which, by the way, is one of the pillars of history. Also, we only had 10 of Caesar's Gallic Wars. We have over 5,000 complete New Testaments, and when you count in the partial New Testaments, we have over 25,000. So the New Testament, according to the bibliographical test, is far better than any of the standards of history that historians use to compare other things to. The internal test says, is it correct for the events of that time era? So, for example, what if the Sermon on the Mount never really happened? Don't you think that other people would have pointed that out in other historical documents of that time era? Yeah, but they didn't. Don't you think that someone like the Jewish or the Roman leaders who wanted to disprove Jesus would have pointed things like that out? And especially when we talk about the resurrection of Jesus, wouldn't it have been far easier for the authorities just to produce his body? Or maybe to say, you went to the wrong grave. But they couldn't do either, as one of their own had Jesus buried in his grave. It was one of the Jewish leaders that gave up his grave so Jesus could be buried there. There is nothing in all of first century literature from the Palestine era that says the grave was anything but empty. Also, the disciples appealed to common everyday events that everyone knew about. Again, there were a lot of people that could have disputed those things, but they didn't. What about people who say there are errors and contradictions in the Bible? Well, ask them to point one out. Chances are they can't. Even if there are some seeming errors, just a little bit of research or study will prove them wrong. I'll give you an example. The Bible talks in the Old Testament about the Hittite nation, and it says where the Hittite nation was, and it was north of Israel. It was in the Lebanon-Turkey area. Well, in the late 1800s, a lot of what we would call critical Bible scholars said, we see no proof of a Hittite nation at all, and we just think this was made up. Now, there's a difference between not seeing any proof of it and actually proving that it didn't exist. But what they found out was at the end of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire, which was Muslim, when they were defeated and Britain took over that area, especially in the 1920s, there was a lot of archaeological work done in that area. And guess what? They found the Hittite nation exactly where the Bible said it was. There's also in Matthew chapter 3, verse 1, it talks about John the Baptist initially baptizing people in the desert of Judea. Again, if there was no desert in Judea, don't you think somebody would have pointed that out? So, in terms of the internal test, and there's many other examples I could give in that regard, but again, the Bible always proves out accurate. There are times when the Bible says things that we can't prove, but that's only because archaeology hasn't turned those things up yet. But in terms of the internal aspects of the Bible, especially the New Testament, the Bible is just far and away better than all the historical documents we have. The third test is the historical test. Do other documents agree or disagree with the Bible? Again, after a lot of these tests, especially in the early part of the 20th century, for example, Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, he's considered a first-rate, first-century Middle Eastern historian. When you read through Luke, there's a lot of little things in there that he puts in there that historians love because they can check them out. Also, Josephus, who was a Jewish general, and later he became a historian, he corroborates many things that are talked about in the New Testament. You also have people like Pliny the Younger, Tacitus, people like that, who talk about, yes, there were Christians, yes, they worshiped this guy called Christus or Christ. So there's a lot of other things outside of the Bible that agree with the Bible. And the fourth thing is the archaeological test. We talked a little bit about that, but archaeology has consistently been proving the Bible to be true. And even now in the 1980s and 1990s and the early 2000s, they're finding things that they didn't know about before, or they had no proof of before, but now are agreeing with what the Bible said. We had no archaeological proof that King David existed, but in the 1990s, guess what? They found proof that he existed. Also, the late 20th century archaeologist Nelson Gluck, who is Jewish, by the way, has come out and said that there is no archaeological find that has ever been produced that disagrees with the Bible. Again, that can be said of no other historical religion. Now, when I first became a Christian and I was learning all about Christianity and it was blowing my mind, I couldn't believe how logical all of this stuff was. I took a religion class at the college I went to because I wanted to see, well, what do the other religions believe? What about Hinduism, Buddhism, things like that? I thought, I'm sure because a lot of people believe them, that those are rational religions. I was shocked to find out that they weren't. In all of their holy books, there is very, very little historical evidences of what they claim. Even in things like Mormonism, which is an American-grown religion, there is very little proof of what they believe. In fact, there is a lot of proof that disagrees with Mormonism. So all of this is to say, we can definitely say the Bible is extremely accurate. Now that doesn't say it's from God. How do we prove that? Well, one way of proving it is to look at fulfilled prophecy. Ezekiel comes up with a prophecy about the city of Tyre, and that's in modern-day Lebanon. He says specific things are going to happen to Tyre, and he names those things, like a certain king will conquer Tyre, a fishing net will be spread over the entire city, things like that. Peter Stoner, a professor at Pasadena City College in the 1940s and 1950s, gave his statistics class the problem of figuring out the chances that this one prophecy would happen by chance. And there were I think there were 11 different things in that prophecy. They came up with one chance in 75 million. Now that's one chance in 75 followed by 6 zeros. That's pretty low, that all of those things would happen by chance. Scientists have defined something as having a 0% chance of happening if it's one chance in 10 to the 53rd power, and that is one chance in the number 1 followed by 53 zeros. Now, if you take just 11 Old Testament prophecies, and I've heard, I can't confirm this, I've heard there's over 2,000 prophecies in the Bible, or fulfilled prophecies in the Bible, but just take 11 Old Testament prophecies. The chance of them happening by chance is one chance in 10 to the 59th power. That is one chance in the number 1 followed by 59 zeros. That is 1,000,000 times impossible. And that's just 11 Old Testament prophecies happening just the way the Bible said they would. Let's take a look at Messianic prophecies. That is, prophecies that about the coming Messiah that Jesus fulfilled. And I think there's like 363 Messianic prophecies that he fulfilled. Professor Stoner took just 48 of those. The chance of one person fulfilling 48 of these messianic prophecies by chance is one chance in 10 to the 157th power. That is one chance in the number 1 followed by 157 zeros. That's way beyond comprehension. Some scientists have estimated that there are 10 to the 80th power particles in our known universe. That's atoms in our known universe. Think about how big our universe is. Our universe is 16 followed by 19 zeros miles long. So if you take, that's the diameter of it, if you take 10 to the 77th number of these universes and you mark one particle and you throw it in to not just our universe, but 10 to the 77th number of universes, what's your chance of picking out the right particle? And that's just 48 prophecies of over 300 messianic prophecies that he fulfills. Then what happens when you take over 2,000 fulfilled prophecies in the Bible? In Isaiah chapter 41, verse 23, the prophet throws out this challenge to the heathen gods that some of the people were worshiping. And he says this, "Show the things that are to come hereafter, that we may know you are gods." God has taken that challenge and he has proved that his word, the Bible, is divinely inspired. All of this together, I think, says beyond a reasonable doubt that the Bible is divinely inspired. If you'd like to look up how these the statistics behind this, behind some of these prophecies were figured out, you can take a look at a website that I have listed on a handout sheet. It's http://scienceSpeaks.dstoner.net. And if you look at chapters 2 and 3, it's an online book. And if you look at chapters 2 and 3, they go into the specific details of this. And they go into several more of the prophecies also. So that is a really great online reference tool for you to look at. And I encourage you to read that. Well, that's about it for now. We'll talk with you next week.